My husband changed the locks while I was at the doctor. I came home to find my suitcases on the street. I just laughed out loud. Good luck, darling. He had no idea the house was actually in my name only. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. People always say that hindsight is 20/20, and Lord, were they right. I'm Marjorie Haywood. I'm 68 years old, and I've lived in the same house on Clover Hill Road in Millbrook, Tennessee, for nearly my entire adult life. My parents built that house in 1961. My father poured the concrete of the front steps with his own hands. My mother planted the dogwood tree in the backyard that still blooms every April without fail, reliable as sunrise, reliable as grief. When they passed, Mama in 2004, Daddy 2 years later, they left the house to me. Not to me and my husband, to me, Marjorie Ann Haywood, Nick Ellaway. That distinction, which once seemed like a mere legal formality, would become the most important fact of my life. I met Randy Haywood at a church picnic in 1981. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming, effortlessly, almost carelessly, like a man who has never had to try very hard because the world has always smiled on him. He had a good laugh, a firm handshake, and a way of making you feel like the only person in the room. We married within a year. I won't say it was a mistake from the start, because it wasn't. We had 37 years that contained real things. A daughter named Caroline, Sunday dinners, a garden I was proud of, arguments about nothing that dissolved by morning. I don't believe in rewriting the past just because it ended badly. But marriages change, people change, or perhaps they simply stop pretending. The first thing I noticed, and dismissed as women of my generation are trained to do, was the phone. Randy had always been the kind of man who left his cell phone on the kitchen counter, face up, unconcerned. Around the spring of 2022, the phone disappeared into his pocket. Always. Even when he was just moving from the living room to the garage, I told myself he'd read an article about electromagnetic fields. I told myself a lot of things. Then came the late evenings. Randy had been retired for 6 years, and retirement had suited him. Early dinners, the news at 7, asleep by 10. But suddenly, he was meeting the guys from the lodge on Tuesday nights, coming home past 11 smelling of cologne I didn't recognize. Not alcohol. Cologne. There's something particularly insulting about a man who bothers to put on cologne for someone else. I didn't confront him. Not yet. I watched. By August, I had noticed that he'd begun taking an unusual interest in my filing cabinet. The one in the small office off the hallway, where I kept the house documents, insurance papers, Mama and Daddy's estate records. I'd come home one afternoon to find the drawer slightly open and a folder turned the wrong way. Randy knew I kept everything in order. He'd teased me about it for decades. So why would he go through those files? I said nothing. I started photographing the contents of that cabinet every time I left the house. September came, and with it, a feeling I cannot fully describe. A low, cold certainty, like knowing a storm is coming, not because you've checked the forecast, but because your bones ache. I began paying attention to small things. A receipt for dinner for 2 at a restaurant I'd never been to. A charge on our joint account for a hotel 40 miles away. Nothing dramatic, nothing a lawyer could immediately use. Just a quiet, accumulating dread. And then came the day that changed everything. It was a Thursday in October. I had a routine appointment with my cardiologist. Just a checkup, nothing serious. I drove myself, as I always did. The appointment took longer than expected. Doctor, Okafor wanted to adjust my medication, and we talked for nearly an hour. By the time I pulled back onto Clover Hill Road, the afternoon light was already thinning. I saw the suitcases first. 3 of them, lined up on the front porch like soldiers. My suitcases. The set my daughter Caroline had given me for my 65th birthday. Navy blue with the little gold clasps. Beside them, 2 cardboard boxes stuffed with what appeared to be my clothes, my books, my bathroom things. The front door was closed. I sat in the car for a moment. Then I got out. I walked to the door and tried my key. It didn't turn. I stood there on the porch of the house my father had built, in front of the dogwood tree my mother had planted, and I understood exactly what had happened. Randy had changed the locks while I was at the doctor. He had packed my belongings. He had decided that this was over, and that he would be the one to decide the terms. The door opened. Randy stood in the frame, and behind him, barely visible in the hallway shadows, was a woman I recognized vaguely from town. Younger than me by at least 20 years. Her name, I would later learn, was Tammy Briggs. Randy crossed his arms and said, with a steadiness that told me he'd rehearsed this, "Marjorie, I think it's time we go our separate ways. I've packed your things. I'd like you to leave." I looked at him. I looked at the woman behind him. I looked at the suitcases my daughter had given me. And I laughed. Not a broken laugh, not a hysterical one. A clear, full laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and certain. "Good luck, sweetheart," I said. He didn't know. He truly did not know. That the house he was standing in, the house he was locking me out of, was not his. It had never been his. And what he'd done today in front of a witness would cost him everything. But that understanding would come to him slowly. I intended to make sure of that. I didn't sleep that night in the house on Clover Hill Road because I wasn't in it. I drove to Caroline's. My daughter lives 20 minutes away, in a small brick house she shares with her husband, Tom, and their 2 teenagers. She met me at the door in her bathrobe. I'd called from the car, and when she saw my face, she didn't ask questions. She just held the door open wide. That's the kind of woman I raised, and in that moment I was more grateful for it than I can say. I sat at her kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea, and I told her everything. Not in a rush, not in tears, but methodically, the way I had always approached problems that mattered. Caroline listened without interrupting, which cost her something. I could see it in the way she pressed her lips together. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Mom," she said carefully, "does Randy know whose name is on the deed?" "I don't know what he knows," I said, "but I know what the deed says." That was the first time I felt it. Not fear exactly, but a sharp, clarifying anger. The kind that doesn't make you reckless. The kind that makes you very, very careful. I lay in Caroline's guest room that night, and I did not cry. What I did instead was think. I ran through everything I knew. The facts, the timeline, the assets, the papers. Randy and I had a joint checking account and a joint savings account. The house was mine, recorded in my name alone, inherited from my parents. Randy's name had never been added to the deed, a fact he had apparently not investigated as thoroughly as he should have before locking me out of it. We had no prenuptial agreement. Tennessee was not a community property state, but it did recognize marital contribution to assets, a distinction I intended to understand completely before I did anything else. What had I lost? I tallied it like a ledger. I had lost access to my home. Temporarily, I had lost, or Randy had tried to take, my sense of security, my dignity, my daily life. I noted that. What did I still have? Quite a lot, as it turned out. I had the deed to the house. I had a daughter who believed me. I had 43 years of careful living that had taught me not to act before I understood the ground beneath my feet. and I had the photographs I'd taken of the filing cabinet contents, stored safely in the cloud, backed up twice, because my grandson had taught me how to do that the previous Christmas. In the morning, I borrowed Caroline's computer and I wrote a list. First, I needed an attorney, not a general practitioner, a family law attorney with experience in property disputes and marital asset division in Tennessee. I asked Caroline's neighbor, Linda, who had been through a divorce 5 years ago, for a recommendation. She gave me a name without hesitating: Ellen Marsh, downtown Millbrook, second floor above the insurance office. Second, I needed to understand the extent of the financial damage. Randy had access to our joint accounts. I needed to know immediately what he had or hadn't already moved. I called the bank from Caroline's kitchen, my account, my right, and learned that 2 days prior, Randy had transferred $8,000 from our joint savings into an account I didn't recognize. I wrote that number down. I wrote everything down. Third, I needed documentation of what had happened the previous afternoon. The locked door, the suitcases on the porch, the woman standing behind him in my hallway. I had taken 3 photographs from the car before I'd gotten out. I hadn't even realized I was doing it. Pure instinct. And those photographs showed the suitcases, the porch, and the timestamp. I uploaded them alongside the cabinet photos. Fourth, I would not contact Randy directly. Not yet. Every instinct I had told me that the moment I picked up the phone and argued with him, I would give him information I didn't want him to have, about what I knew, what I planned, what I felt. Silence, I had learned over 68 years, is often the most powerful language available. The plan that emerged over those 48 hours at Caroline's was not complicated. Complexity, in my experience, is the enemy of execution. The plan was simple: establish my legal position, document everything, move swiftly, and let the law do what the law was designed to do. Randy had made a significant error. He had acted dramatically, emotionally, without consulting a lawyer, which told me he didn't fully understand his legal exposure. That was his disadvantage. I intended to keep it that way for as long as possible. Caroline offered to confront him herself. "No," I said. "Mom, he threw you out of your own house." "I know what he did, and confronting him before I'm ready would warn him. Right now, the best thing you can do is let me handle this the right way." She didn't like it, but she trusted me. And trust between a mother and daughter is its own kind of power. I called Ellen Marsh's office that same afternoon. The receptionist said the earliest appointment was in 4 days. I said I needed something sooner. I explained, briefly and factually, what had happened. There was a pause. "Can you come in tomorrow at 8:30? The receptionist said. I said yes. That evening, sitting in Caroline's guest room with my legal pad and my borrowed reading glasses, I felt the fear, really felt it, beneath all the planning, cold and real. I was 68 years old. I had lived in that house for decades. My mother's china was in that kitchen. My father's handwriting was on the wall of the pantry where he'd marked my height as a child. The idea that a man I had fed and washed and stood beside at funerals, had decided he could simply remove me from my own life like an outdated piece of furniture was not just legally wrong. It was the kind of wrong that doesn't leave you unchanged. I folded the fear up and put it somewhere it could be useful. Then I went back to my list. Ellen Marsh's office smelled of old wood and fresh coffee, which I found reassuring. Some environments tell you immediately whether you're in capable hands. Ellen herself was in her mid-50s, with reading glasses on a chain, and the unhurried manner of a woman who has seen everything and remains surprised by nothing. She shook my hand, gestured to the chair across from her desk, and said, "Tell me what happened." I told her. All of it. I put my legal pad on her desk, the photographs on her desk, the bank notification on her desk. I had learned from years of dealing with contractors and insurance companies and school administrators that the person who comes in organized gets taken more seriously than the person who comes in upset. Upset is understandable. Organized is powerful. When I finished, Ellen was quiet for a moment. She looked at the deed, the copy I'd retrieved from my photographs of the filing cabinet. And then she looked at me. "Mrs. Haywood," she said, "your husband changed the locks on a house that is legally your sole property. He is currently occupying it without your permission, along with a third party you did not authorize to be there. In Tennessee, that constitutes unlawful detainer. We can file an emergency petition." I asked her to explain what that meant in plain terms. "It means," she said, "that a judge can order him out within days, not weeks, days. The fact that you've been married doesn't give him title to a property that was inherited solely by you and remains in your name." Tennessee Code, Section 66-6-101 is very clear. Your name is on that deed. His is not. He has no legal right to be there without your consent. And based on what you've described, he is there with the explicit intent of excluding you. That's actionable. I felt something shift in my chest. Not joy, exactly. Something quieter. Confirmation. We talked for nearly 2 hours. Ellen outlined the divorce proceedings, which I had already decided were inevitable, alongside the property recovery. She explained the $8,000 transfer, which could constitute dissipation of marital assets, a term that carried real legal weight. She told me what to document, what not to say, and what to expect. She was honest about the emotional cost, which I appreciated more than false comfort. When I left her office, I sat in my car in the small parking lot behind the building and looked at the ordinary street beyond. A hardware store, a dry cleaner, a woman pushing a stroller. And I thought, he did not expect this. He thought I would panic. He thought I would call him, crying, and beg to come home. He thought this was over. He had 48 years of knowing me, and he still did not know me at all. Ellen filed the emergency petition that afternoon. What I didn't anticipate, what I should have anticipated, was that Randy had apparently begun to sense something had shifted. Perhaps it was the silence. He'd expected calls and had received none. He'd expected tears and had received nothing. By Thursday, 3 days after the lockout, Carolyn told me he had driven past her house twice in one afternoon. She'd seen him slow down, look at the windows, and drive on. "He's nervous," Caroline said. "Good," I said. But Tammy Briggs, I would discover, was not a stupid woman. She was calculating in the way that people are calculating when they have something specific to gain. And she had been calculating for longer than I knew. That same Thursday, my friend Dolores, who has known me for 30 years and sees everything that happens in a 3-mile radius of Millbrook, called to tell me she'd seen Tammy at the county courthouse that morning, not in the clerk's office, standing outside the property records window. Tammy had been looking up the deed. I called Ellen immediately. "She knows," I said. "Good," Ellen said. "Let her look. The deed is public record. It doesn't change what it says." But it told me something crucial. They were no longer operating from assumption. They now knew, or Tammy knew and would tell Randy, that the house was mine, which meant the dynamic had shifted. They had made their move in ignorance, and now they were scrambling to understand what they'd walked into. The direct evidence I had been missing came not from a private investigator or a court document, but from something far more mundane, a forwarded email. Randy, in a lapse of judgment that I can only attribute to overconfidence, had sent a message to Tammy from our shared family email account, the one we'd used for years for household things, subscriptions, medical appointment reminders. He had forgotten, apparently, that I had set up that account and still had full access to it. The message, dated 6 weeks before he changed the locks, laid out a plan with a clarity that made me sit down heavily in Caroline's kitchen chair. He had written, and I am paraphrasing because the words are not mine to reproduce, that once I was out of the picture, Tammy could move in immediately, that he intended to claim the house as a marital asset in the divorce, that he had consulted someone, not a lawyer, it emerged, a friend with opinions, who told him that long-term marriage gave him rights to the property regardless of whose name was on it. He had written that he expected me to be too frightened and too old to fight properly. Too old. I read that phrase twice. Then I forwarded the email to Ellen Marsh. That, Ellen said when she called me back, is exactly what we needed. I hung up the phone and looked out Caroline's kitchen window at the ordinary afternoon. The neighbor's dog, the school bus turning the corner, the leaves coming off the oak tree in the yard. And I understood that we had reached a point from which there was no return. Not for me, and certainly not for Randy. The court date for the emergency petition was set for the following Tuesday. In the 5 days between filing and hearing, I kept myself occupied the way I have always kept myself occupied during difficult periods, with methodical action and very little self-pity. Ellen had advised me not to go to the house. I didn't need to be told twice. Clover Hill Road would wait. In the meantime, I worked with her to compile everything: the deed, the email, the bank records showing the $8,000 transfer, the photographs from the day of the lockout, and a written timeline. I prepared myself, dated and specific, covering 6 months of what I had observed. I am not a lawyer, but I know how to write clearly, and I know the value of dates and specifics. And Ellen told me the timeline was one of the most useful client documents she'd received in years. On Saturday, 4 days after the filing, my phone rang. Randy's name on the screen. I let it ring. He called twice more within the hour. Then, just before noon, a text arrived. "Marjorie, we need to talk. This is getting out of hand. Call me." I photographed the text and sent it to Ellen. I did not respond. By Sunday afternoon, the strategy changed. Randy and Tammy drove to Caroline's house. I saw them from the upstairs window. Randy's truck in the driveway, Randy getting out, Tammy staying in the passenger seat, visible, deliberate, like a statement. Caroline, to her enormous credit, went to the door before I could stop her. I came downstairs. Randy looked different than I expected. Not triumphant, as I'd imagined he might look when I first saw those suitcases. He looked tight around the jaw, controlled, but barely. "Marjorie," he said, "this lawyer business is unnecessary. You're making this ugly." "You changed the locks," I said. "I want a clean split, that's all. We sign some papers, we go our separate ways, no courts involved." "And the house?" I asked. Something passed over his face. He'd spoken to someone, a lawyer, finally, and the conversation had not gone the way he'd hoped. I could see it. "We can negotiate the house," he said carefully. "There's nothing to negotiate, Randy. The house is mine." That's when Tammy got out of the truck. She walked up the driveway with the measured confidence of someone who has prepared what she intends to say. She was dressed neatly, carefully, and she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as rehearsed sympathy. "Mrs. Haywood," she said, "I think if we all calm down—" "You're on my daughter's property," I said. "You weren't invited." Tammy's expression didn't change immediately, but something behind her eyes did. She looked at Randy. He was looking at the ground. Then her tone shifted. The sympathy dropped away like a coat she'd decided was too warm. You think a piece of paper is going to protect you? She said quietly. Randy's been in that marriage for decades. Courts don't ignore that. You'd better think carefully about what kind of fight you want. There it was, the threat they'd been building toward. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, I've already thought carefully. My attorney filed an emergency petition 4 days ago. The hearing is Tuesday. I'd suggest Randy speak to his lawyer before then. The silence that followed was the kind you can feel. Randy grabbed Tammy's arm, gently but firmly, and steered her back toward the truck. He turned once at the end of the driveway. You're making a mistake, he said. Randy, I said, you wrote an email about me 6 weeks ago. I have it. He got in the truck. They left. Caroline stood beside me on the porch, and we watched the truck disappear around the corner. My heart was beating hard. I won't pretend it wasn't. There's something viscerally unpleasant about being threatened on your daughter's porch by a woman your husband brought to replace you. I felt it. But I also felt the specific clarity that comes from having the truth in your corner. Tuesday's hearing was brief, as emergency hearings often are. Randy arrived with an attorney he'd clearly retained in a hurry, a general practitioner, competent but unprepared for what Ellen had assembled. The judge, a careful woman in her 60s named the Honorable Patricia Rowe, reviewed the deed, the emergency petition, the photograph evidence, and the unlawful detainer filing. She asked Randy's attorney 2 questions. His attorney answered both inadequately. Judge Rowe ordered Randy and any occupants to vacate the property at 14 Clover Hill Road within 72 hours and return all keys to the plaintiff, that was me, forthwith. She also issued a temporary freeze on the joint financial accounts, pending the divorce proceedings. Randy went pale. I didn't smile. I simply wrote down the order number in my legal pad and thanked Ellen quietly. That evening, I allowed myself something I had not allowed since the lockout. I did nothing. I sat in Caroline's backyard in the October dusk, in a lawn chair with a quilt over my knees, and I let the events of the past 2 weeks simply exist without requiring anything from me. Caroline brought me a cup of tea and sat beside me without speaking, which was exactly right. I was not unharmed. Let me be honest about that. What Randy had done, the betrayal of it, the contempt of it, the cold efficiency of having packed my things while I was at the cardiologist, had left marks that wouldn't heal quickly. But I had done what needed to be done. And in 3 days, I was going home. Randy vacated the house on the 3rd day. Not the 1st, not the 2nd, but precisely at the deadline, which told me he'd consulted his new lawyer thoroughly and understood that violating the court order would make everything significantly worse for him. He left quietly. No drama, no phone calls. Just gone. I drove to Clover Hill Road alone that Friday morning. I sat in the car for a moment before going in, the way you sometimes pause before entering a place you love after a long absence, wanting to hold the anticipation just a little longer. Then I took out the new key Ellen had arranged. The locksmith had come the day after the court order, accompanied by Caroline and Tom, and I unlocked the front door of my house. He had not damaged anything. That surprised me, I'll admit. The furniture was where it had always been. The kitchen was in order, if unfamiliar in the small way that a space becomes unfamiliar when someone else has been living in it. My mother's china was intact. My father's height markings were still on the pantry wall. What was missing were his things, his clothes, his tools, the fishing gear that had lived in the garage for 30 years. He had taken what was his and left what was mine. And there was something in that that felt less like dignity and more like retreat. I opened every window in the house, let the October air move through. I was home. The first attempt at what I can only call temptation came 4 days after my return. Randy sent a card. Not an email, not a text. A physical card. The kind from the drugstore, with a painted autumn scene on the front. Inside, in his handwriting, he had written that he was sorry for how things had happened, that he hadn't meant for it to go this far, that he hoped we could settle the divorce quietly and fairly without the courts involved. He mentioned, as if in passing, that the house might be something we could discuss privately, just the two of us, outside the legal process. I read the card twice. I recognized what it was. It wasn't remorse. It was strategy. His lawyer had told him that the email, the one in which he'd written that he expected me to be too frightened and too old to fight, was damaging, and that the wisest course was now to soften me, to suggest we could negotiate outside the courtroom where that email would be less powerful. He was trying to get me to the table before discovery could proceed. I gave the card to Ellen. "Hold on to it," she said. "It establishes that he's aware of potential liability." What Randy didn't understand, couldn't understand perhaps because he had spent decades watching me manage and accommodate and keep the peace, was that I had no interest in a quiet settlement that protected him. I had interest in a fair resolution, and fair and quiet are not always the same thing. Was I tempted? I want to be honest. There was a moment, holding that card with its painted autumn leaves, when I felt the pull of the life that had been 37 years of something that had contained real love, even if love had drained out of it by the end. The temptation wasn't to forgive him. It was simpler and more dangerous than that. It was the temptation to be done, to skip to the end, to take whatever he offered just to stop feeling the weight of it. I put the card in the folder with the email and the bank statements. That's where it belonged. The support I found in those weeks was something I hadn't expected, or hadn't expected to matter as much as it did. I had always been self-sufficient in a way that sometimes kept people at a careful distance, and I had taken a kind of quiet pride in that. But isolation, I discovered, is only manageable until the stakes become real. Once they became real, I needed people. And people, to my genuine surprise, were there. Dolores came every Tuesday with food and conversation, and the particular gift she has of talking about everything and nothing, filling the silence without demanding anything from it. My neighbor, Helen, who I had known for 23 years without knowing well, appeared at my door one Saturday morning with a casserole and the information that she had, herself, gone through something similar in 1997, and that she had come out the other side, and that I would too. Caroline called every morning at 8, just to check in. Sometimes we talked for an hour, sometimes for 3 minutes, but the call always came. And then there was the women's group at First Methodist, a group I had attended sporadically for years without fully belonging to. I went on a Wednesday evening, 6 days after returning to the house, and I told them what had happened. Not everything, not the legal details, but enough. The room was quiet when I finished. And then a woman named Ruth, who is 81 and has buried 2 husbands, reached across and put her hand over mine and said, "You did the right thing, and you'll keep doing the right thing. We'll be here." I went home that night feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Randy, I knew, was watching. Caroline reported that he'd called twice, not to her, but to Tom, trying to take the temperature of the situation through a side channel. Tammy had been seen again near the county courthouse. Their surveillance of me was clumsy and obvious, the kind of watching that people do when they're afraid, not when they're confident. Let them watch. I had nothing to hide and everything to prove. They came on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after I'd returned to the house. I saw the truck from the kitchen window while I was making coffee. and I had exactly enough time to set my cup down before the doorbell rang. I stood in my kitchen for a moment, my kitchen, with my mother's copper pot on the stove and my father's marks on the pantry door. And I breathed. Then I went to the door. They were both on the porch. Randy was holding a small paper bag. From the bakery on Elm Street, I noticed, which had been our bakery for 30 years, where we had bought coffee cake after church on Sunday mornings for longer than I could remember. The choice of the bag was not accidental. Tammy stood slightly behind him, dressed carefully, hands folded. She had the look of someone who has prepared a role and is committed to performing it. "Morning, Marjorie," Randy said. He had his soft voice on, the one I remembered from arguments in earlier years when he wanted to de-escalate. "We just thought we'd come by. Talk, maybe. Nothing formal." I stepped out onto the porch rather than invite them in. My house, my terms. "All right," I said. Tammy spoke first, which surprised me. "Mrs. Haywood, I want to apologize for the way things happened. I didn't want it to go the way it did." She met my eyes when she said it, which I gave her partial credit for, while also noticing that she was apologizing for the method and not the fact. A careful apology, a lawyer's apology. "I appreciate that," I said, in a tone that indicated nothing. Randy set the bakery bag on the porch railing. "Marjorie," he said, and his voice shifted. Lower, older, something in it reaching back across 37 years. "We had something real. I know that. And I'm not asking to go back. I'm just asking if we can end this without destroying each other. You know what legal proceedings do to a family. Caroline is in the middle of this. The grandkids. There's no reason for it to go that far." There it was. The children, the grandchildren, the family. He was not wrong that court proceedings are hard on families. That was true. But he was using that truth as a tool, and I heard the difference. "Randy," I said, "what exactly are you proposing?" He had clearly prepared for this moment. He proposed, in organized terms that his lawyer had almost certainly helped him construct, a mediated settlement outside of court. He would relinquish any claim to the house in exchange for a more favorable division of the liquid marital assets, the joint accounts, a small investment account I'd built over 20 years of careful saving. He framed it as fairness. He framed it as mercy. What he was proposing, in plain terms, was that I trade away the financial security of my retirement in exchange for keeping a house that was already legally mine. I looked at him. I looked at Tammy. I thought of the email, too frightened and too old to fight properly. "I have an attorney," I said. "All proposals go through her." Something shifted in Tammy. She had been performing patience, but patience, for certain people, is finite. "Mrs. Haywood," she said, and the careful tone was mostly gone now. "You are 78 years old." "68, I said. She continued, without pausing. "And this process is going to be long and expensive and hard on your health. Is that really what you want? Because Randy is prepared to be reasonable. But if you insist on going through the courts, we will contest the inheritance claim. We'll argue marital contribution. We'll make the case that decades of marriage created equity in this property, and we will drag this out for as long as it takes." I listened to all of it. Then I said quietly, "Are you finished?" She blinked. "You drove to my house on a Saturday morning with a bakery bag and a speech," I said. "That tells me you're worried. If your legal position were strong, you wouldn't be here. You'd be in court." I picked up the bakery bag and held it out to Randy. "Thank you for coming by." Randy took the bag. His jaw was tight. He opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again. "You're going to regret this," he said. "Possibly," I said, "but not for the reason you think." They left. I went inside and closed the door and stood in the hallway for a long moment. My hands, I noticed, were trembling slightly. Not from fear exactly, but from the particular expenditure of holding yourself completely steady when everything in you wants to react. I sat down in the armchair in the living room, the one that had been my mother's. The fear was real. I want to be clear about that. Tammy's threat, the promise to contest, to drag it out, to fight every inch, was not empty. Court proceedings are expensive. They are exhausting. I was 68 years old, alone, with a heart condition that required monitoring, and she had known exactly where to aim when she mentioned my health. But the fear had an interesting quality. Instead of freezing me, it clarified me. It laid out exactly what was at stake in precise, unflinching terms. And once I could see the stakes, that clearly the path forward was not less certain. It was more. I called Ellen Monday morning and told her everything. She listened carefully. "They're bluffing about the inheritance claim," she said. "Tennessee courts have been very consistent on inherited property and sole ownership. Their case there is weak. But the marital contribution argument, that's where they'd put their energy. We need to be ready for it." "Then let's be ready for it," I said. The divorce hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in December, 7 weeks after the lockout. December in Millbrook is gray and cold, the trees stripped bare, everything visible. I have always thought that winter is the most honest season. There is nowhere to hide. Walking into the Rutherford County Courthouse that morning, I thought that was appropriate. Ellen and I had prepared for 6 weeks. We had the deed, the email, the bank records, the photographs, the timeline, and 2 additional pieces of documentation that Ellen had obtained through discovery. Randy's bank statements for the 18 months prior to the lockout and his phone records from the same period. The bank statements revealed not 1, but 4 transfers to accounts linked to Tammy Briggs. Small enough individually not to alarm an inattentive spouse, large enough in aggregate to constitute, in Ellen's precise language, a pattern of intentional financial diversion from marital assets. The total across 18 months, $22,000. Randy's attorney, a more experienced man than the one he'd brought to the emergency hearing, someone named Walters, who wore good suits and had the careful manner of a professional who has learned to expect surprises, had presumably reviewed the same documents. He looked, when I saw him in the hallway outside the courtroom, like a man who had stayed up late. Tammy was not a party to the divorce proceedings, but she was present in the gallery as a witness for Randy's side, there to testify about their relationship and its timeline. I had expected that. What I had not known, but Ellen had learned through a deposition 2 weeks prior, was that Tammy had her own financial exposure. One of the 4 transfers had come from a home equity line of credit that Randy had quietly opened against a jointly owned storage property in both our names. He had not obtained my signature because he had forged it. That discovery, late in the preparation, had taken my breath away. I had sat in Ellen's office and simply looked at the paper for a long moment. 37 years. And somewhere in there, he had forged my signature on a legal document. Ellen had referred that specific matter to the district attorney's office. There were now 2 proceedings, not 1. Judge Rowe presided again, the same careful woman from the emergency hearing. Randy and Walters sat across the aisle. I sat with Ellen, my legal pad on my knee, my hands still. The hearing opened with the property issue. Walters argued the marital contribution doctrine competently. He was a skilled attorney, making the case that decades of shared life created an equitable interest in the property, regardless of whose name was on the deed. Ellen responded with the specific Tennessee precedents, the nature of the inheritance, the fact that Randy's name had been offered and declined at the time of the estate transfer. A detail confirmed by a surviving note from my parents' estate attorney, whom Ellen had tracked down and deposed. When Walters rested his argument, Judge Rowe asked Randy 2 questions directly. That was the first crack. "Mr. Haywood," she said, "were you aware, at the time of your marriage, that the property at 14 Clover Hill Road was held solely in your wife's name?" Randy hesitated. "I understood it was a family property." "Were you aware," the judge repeated with the patience of someone who has learned not to accept non-answers, "that your name was not on the deed?" "I assumed." "Thank you." The second crack came during the financial portion. Ellen presented the bank records. She presented the transfers to Tammy's accounts. She presented the equity line of credit, and then, measured and factual, informed the court that the district attorney's office had opened an inquiry into the signature on that document. The room was very quiet. Walters asked for a recess. Judge Rowe allowed 10 minutes. I sat in the hallway on a wooden bench and watched the winter light come through the tall windows. Ellen sat beside me, reviewing notes. From the direction of the small conference room at the end of the hall, I could hear raised voices. Randy's and Walters's, one controlled and one not. I did not try to make out the words. When we returned to the courtroom, Randy was different. The controlled, prepared demeanor of the morning had developed fractures. He was pale. He sat too still. The stillness of a man trying very hard not to show that something has gone badly wrong. Tammy, in the gallery, was white. She took the stand when called. Ellen's cross-examination was methodical and unhurried, the way a careful surgeon works, not the way a theatrical attorney works. Question by question, Tammy's account of the timeline of her relationship with Randy diverged from the phone records. Small inconsistencies, each one minor, each one documented. The account she had prepared and that their relationship had begun after Randy and I had already separated was dismantled date by date. At one point, Tammy looked directly at Randy from the stand. It was not a loving look. Randy, for his part, had stopped taking notes. His pen was on the table. He was looking at the surface of the table in front of him, and he had the expression of a man who has played a hand of cards and watched, card by card, as his hand turned out to be much weaker than he had believed. Was I glad? I'm not sure that's the right word. There is a kind of satisfaction in the truth being documented, official, on the record. Not a happy satisfaction, but a just one. The kind that feels like the world briefly working the way it is supposed to work. Judge Rowe took a 20-minute recess to review the morning's material. When she returned, she did not make me wait. Judge Rowe's ruling, when it came, was 23 pages. I know because Ellen sent me a copy that afternoon, and I read every page that evening at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and my reading glasses. I will summarize what the court found. On the matter of the property at 14 Clover Hill Road, the court upheld sole ownership in Marjorie Ann Haywood, née Calloway, as established by the deed of inheritance. The marital contribution doctrine, the court found, was inapplicable given the nature of the inheritance, the absence of Randy's name from the deed at the time of transfer, which had been a knowing decision, documented by the estate attorney's records, and the fact that no joint financial contributions to the property's mortgage had been made, as the house had been inherited free and clear. Randy Haywood had no legal claim to the property. None. On the matter of the marital assets, the court noted the pattern of financial transfers. $22,000 diverted from joint accounts and a joint collateralized equity line to accounts associated with Tammy Briggs over an 18-month period. This constituted dissipation of marital assets. In compensating for this dissipation, the court awarded Marjorie Haywood a greater share of the liquid marital estate than would otherwise have been standard. The investment account, 20 years of careful saving, $31,000, was awarded to me in full. On the matter of the forged signature, the court noted that this matter had been referred to the district attorney and declined to adjudicate it separately. But the judge's written opinion included language I will not soon forget. She wrote that the court found evidence of a pattern of deliberate deception and financial manipulation by the respondent that significantly undermined the foundational trust of the marital relationship. That was in a legal document, on the record, permanently. Randy's attorney filed a notice of intent to appeal on 2 minor procedural grounds. Ellen reviewed it and told me, calmly, that the grounds were thin and that she expected the appeal to go nowhere. She was right. It was dismissed 4 months later without a hearing. When I walked out of that courthouse on a gray December afternoon, the cold hit me immediately. The particular cold of Tennessee in winter, dry and clean. I stood on the courthouse steps and breathed it in for a moment. The same steps I had driven past hundreds of times without ever having occasion to walk up. Caroline was waiting on the sidewalk below. She had taken the day off work to be there, though she hadn't been permitted in the courtroom. When she saw my face, she understood. She came up the steps and hugged me, and I let her. "It's done?" she said. "It's done," I said. We stood there together on the courthouse steps for a moment, my daughter and I. In the December cold, in the town I had lived in my whole life, in the state my parents had raised me in. The dogwood in my backyard would bloom again in April. My mother's china was in its cabinet. My father's handwriting was on the pantry wall. Randy, I learned later through channels I won't detail, had left the courthouse that afternoon a shaken man. Walters had been professional about informing him of what the ruling meant for the divorce, for the ongoing district attorney's matter regarding the forged signature, for the financial reality of his position going forward. Randy had left the marriage with his truck, his fishing gear, his personal belongings, and a share of the joint accounts diminished by the court's finding of dissipation. He had walked into a courthouse expecting to emerge with a house and a girlfriend, and a clean start. He walked out with none of it. I will not say I felt no satisfaction. I am human. But the dominant feeling, sitting in Ellen's office afterward for a brief debrief, was not triumph. It was something quieter, an exhale. The specific feeling of a thing having been settled correctly, of a wrong that had been named and documented and addressed according to the rules that exist for exactly that purpose. The world had worked the way it was supposed to work. "You were very well prepared," Ellen said. "I was organized," I said. "In this work," she said, "they're often the same thing." I went home to Clover Hill Road that evening. I made myself dinner. I sat in my mother's armchair. I looked out the window at the winter yard, at the bare dogwood against the gray sky. I was 68 years old, alone in a house I owned, in possession of my full legal rights and most of my retirement savings, with a daughter who loved me and a community that had shown up. It was enough. It was more than enough. Spring came to Millbrook the way it always does. The redbuds first, and then the dogwood. My mother's dogwood bloomed in April exactly as it always had, white and unhurried and absolute. I spent the winter reacquainting myself with my own life. That sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. I repainted the guest room a color called Quiet Fog, which I had wanted for 3 years and which Randy had found too gray. I joined a morning walking group that met at 6:30 at the park. 8 women between 55 and 78, including Ruth from First Methodist and Dolores, who walked slower than anyone but talked the most. I enrolled in a watercolor class at the community center, which I had thought about and not done for 15 years. I was not talented. I found, to my genuine surprise, that this did not matter. My finances, settled by the court, were stable. The house was mine outright. My cardiologist reported at my February checkup that my blood pressure had come down to normal. I thought the accurate explanation was that I had stopped living with a sustained, low-level threat I hadn't fully recognized for what it was. Caroline and Tom came for Easter. The grandchildren ran in the yard. I made the ham the way Mama used to, and we sat at my table with my mother's tablecloth, and I looked around at the people I had made, and something in me settled like a foundation being poured. Dolores kept me informed of Randy. He had moved in with a cousin in Gallatin, 30 miles away. The district attorney's inquiry into the forged signature had proceeded, and the uncertainty of it hung over him. I did not wish him prosecution specifically. I wished accuracy. The DA's office was being accurate. Tammy Briggs fared poorly in a way that owed nothing to me and everything to her own choices. The relationship with Randy had collapsed under the weight of what their shared future actually contained. A man with no house, diminished assets, and a pending legal matter. By summer, she had moved back to the county she'd come from. She was not mentioned around Millbrook anymore. What I felt when Dolores told me was something close to nothing. The absence of concern rather than the presence of satisfaction. They had made choices. The world had accounted for them. What I enjoyed, genuinely and daily, was the texture of my own life. The morning walk, the coffee after, the watercolor class, Helen from next door, a friendship that had finally, late in both our lives, become what it should have been years ago. The house on Clover Hill Road had always been mine. But that summer, for the first time, it felt entirely like home. Not the home I had shared with someone else, but mine. The place I had chosen, through difficulty and clarity, to return to and inhabit fully. My cardiologist was pleased with my numbers. My daughter called every morning. The dogwood would bloom again in April. People thought that at 68, I was finished. Randy thought I was too old and too frightened to fight. He was wrong on both counts. What I learned is this: know what is yours. Know it legally, know it completely, and document everything. Silence is not weakness. Preparation is not aggression. And the law, when you meet it properly, exists to protect exactly the people it was built for. What would you have done standing on that porch with your suitcases at your feet? I'd love to know. Leave your thoughts below. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for being here. I never told my son I make $80,000 a month. His wife screamed, "Get out, you beggar, we don't need you." My son threw my things out the door. A month later, I bought the house across the street. When he saw my name on the deed. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Ellis, and I was 68 years old when my son threw my suitcase onto the front porch like it was a bag of old newspapers. But let me start before that night. Let me start where things still felt, at least on the surface, like family. I had spent the better part of my adult life building something quietly. After my husband Harold passed, God rest him, I was 51 years old, alone in our house in Boise, Idaho, with a mortgage, a garden, and absolutely no intention of sitting down and grieving myself to death. Harold had been a careful man, a saver, and he left me with a foundation. I built the rest myself. I started with an online resale business. vintage furniture, estate finds, things people threw away that still had life in them. Then I expanded into digital consulting for small antique dealers who had no idea how to sell online. By the time I was 65, I was earning close to $80,000 a month. Not a year. A month. I never told anyone. Not my neighbors. Not my church friends. And certainly not my son Daniel. I want to be clear about why. Harold always said, "Money changes the people around you before it changes you." I had watched it happen to his sister when she inherited their mother's estate. I didn't want to be looked at differently. I didn't want to be a wallet with a grandmother's face. So I lived modestly. I drove a 2017 Honda CR-V. I wore clothes from Costco and the occasional splurge at Chico's. My house in Boise was paid off, simple and full of plants. Daniel was my only child. We were close, or I believed we were close, until he married Brittany Caldwell 4 years ago. Brittany was 34, 12 years younger than Daniel, and she had a way of standing in a room that suggested she was always calculating the square footage. She was not unkind in the beginning. She was careful. There is a difference. An unkind person lets you see their edges. A careful person keeps them hidden until the moment they decide you're no longer useful. The first warning sign came 6 months into their marriage, during Thanksgiving. I had driven up to their home in Portland, a lovely craftsman house Daniel had bought before Brittany, thank God. And I noticed that the photo of Harold and me from Daniel's college graduation had been moved from the living room mantel to a closet shelf. When I asked Daniel about it, he said Brittany was redoing the aesthetic. I smiled and helped with the cranberry sauce. The second warning sign came the following Easter. Brittany made a comment at dinner, lightly, with a laugh, the way people say things they mean, about how it must be so hard living alone on a fixed income. I was sipping my iced tea. I said nothing. Fixed income. I was running 4 revenue streams at the time. The third warning sign came when Daniel called me in October and suggested, gently, carefully, the way Brittany had taught him to be gentle and careful, that I consider selling my Boise house and moving in with them. They had a guest room. It would be easier for everyone. I should have heard the word easier and asked, easier for whom? But I was lonely. That is the truth I am not ashamed of. Harold had been gone 17 years and the evenings were long, and Daniel was my son, my boy, the child I had raised alone after Harold's first heart attack left him half present for years. I said yes. I moved to Portland in January. I brought my plants, my laptop, my external hard drives. My entire business lived on those drives. And 2 boxes of Harold's things I couldn't part with. I paid no rent. I offered to, repeatedly. Daniel said it wasn't necessary. Brittany said nothing, which I later understood was her loudest language. The first 3 weeks were pleasant enough. Then the pleasantness wore thin. Brittany began making comments about my schedule. I worked early mornings, 4 to 8 a.m., before the house woke up. She said the keyboard noise carried. I bought a quieter keyboard. She said the light from my laptop bothered her when she passed the hallway. I started working with the door closed. She said she could hear me on calls. I began using earphones and whispering. I was shrinking. I could feel it. And still I told myself, she is adjusting. This is new for everyone. Daniel loves you. Give it time. Then came the evening of March 14th. I had been on a call with a client in London. It ran long, 20 minutes past what I'd planned. When I came out of the guest room, Brittany was standing in the hallway. Her arms were crossed. Daniel was behind her, and I noticed he was not looking at me. "Margaret," Brittany said. She never called me Mom, not once. "We need to talk about boundaries." I said, of course, and I followed them to the kitchen. What happened next took 11 minutes. I counted them later, lying awake, because that is what you do when your mind needs to measure a wound. Brittany spoke about how this arrangement wasn't working, how I was always underfoot, how the guest room was actually meant to be a home office for her growing candle business, how they had been more than generous. And then she said it. The thing from the title of this story, the thing I will never forget as long as I live. "You're a poor woman living off our hospitality. We don't need a penniless old lady taking up space in our home. Pack your things." I looked at my son. Daniel looked at the kitchen floor, and then he walked to the guest room, and I heard him pulling my suitcase out from under the bed. I stood in that kitchen for exactly the amount of time it took me to decide I would not cry in front of Brittany Caldwell. That was the only decision I made in those first 60 seconds. Everything else, the grief, the disbelief, the specific pain of watching my son refuse to meet my eyes, I folded up and put somewhere behind my sternum, the way you press a letter into an envelope when you're not ready to send it yet. Daniel set my suitcase by the front door. Then he went back for my laptop bag. Then the 2 boxes of Harold's things. He stacked them neatly on the porch, which somehow made it worse. The neatness of it, the care he took arranging my whole life in a 4-foot pile on painted wood. It was 41 degrees outside. I know because I checked my phone as I stood there, because my mind was doing what it always does under pressure, collecting data. Brittany had not followed us to the door. She was already back in the kitchen. I could hear her filling the kettle. "Mom?" Daniel said. He was still not looking at me. "I'm sorry. This is just... it's not working." "You said that," I replied. "You can call me when you get settled." I picked up my laptop bag. I lifted the suitcase handle. I looked at my son. This man I had driven to every soccer practice, every orthodontist appointment, who I had held at 2 in the morning when Harold's heart gave out the first time and Daniel was 16 and terrified. And I said very quietly, "I will." Then I walked to my Honda and I drove. I drove for 20 minutes without knowing where I was going, which is not like me. I am a woman who has had a destination for most of her adult life. But that night, Portland moved past my windows like a city I'd never been to, all wet streets and yellow light. And I just drove until I found myself in the parking lot of a Marriott courtyard near the Lloyd District. I checked in for 3 nights. I paid cash from the emergency envelope I kept in my laptop bag. Harold's habit, passed to me. I went to my room. I sat on the edge of the bed, and I allowed myself exactly 45 minutes to feel everything. I cried for Harold first. I always do in the worst moments, because he would have known what to say and how to say it, and exactly when to put his hand on mine. Then I cried for Daniel, not the man who had stacked my boxes on a 41-degree porch, but the boy I'd raised, who I was now not sure I recognized. Then I cried for myself, briefly and practically, because I have never seen self-pity as a useful long-term activity. At the 46-minute mark, I washed my face, opened my laptop, and started a new document. I titled it, "What is True?" This is something I learned in business and in grief. When everything feels chaotic, establish the facts. So, I wrote them down. What is true? I am 68 years old. I am in good health. I have no mortgage. My business generated $79,400 last month. I have $2.3 million in savings and investments. I have been told I am a burden by a woman who has never asked me a single question about my life. My son did not defend me. I read it back twice. Then I wrote one more line. What is also true? I do not have to accept this as the end of anything. I spent the next 3 days in that hotel room doing two things simultaneously: grieving and planning. I let them run in parallel. In the mornings, I worked client emails, invoices, a new product listing for a Victorian secretary desk I'd sourced in October. In the afternoons, I made calls. I found a furnished apartment in the Irvington neighborhood, 2 miles from Daniel and Brittany's house, available month to month. I signed the lease on day 3. It was a good apartment. High ceilings, original hardwood floors, a kitchen window that looked out onto a maple tree. I paid 6 months up front, which made the landlord visibly relieved and completely uninterested in asking questions. I moved in with my suitcase, my laptop, my drives, and Harold's boxes. I bought groceries. I bought a new plant, a pothos, because they survive anything, and I put it in the kitchen window. And then I sat in my new living room on a rented couch, and I let myself think. Not feel, think. Here is what I thought about. Brittany's face when she said, "penniless old lady." The specific satisfaction in it. The way she had said it like she was issuing a verdict she had prepared well in advance. And I thought about Daniel's silence, which was its own kind of verdict. They had decided who I was. They had built a version of me, small, dependent, a charity case in their Craftsman house. And they had evicted that version. The problem, for them, was that the version they had built had nothing to do with who I actually was. And that gave me an idea. A very specific, very deliberate idea. I opened my laptop and I went to Zillow. I typed in Daniel and Brittany's street address, Sycamore Lane, Portland, Oregon, and I looked at what was available in their neighborhood. There was one listing that stopped my scrolling. Directly across the street from their Craftsman home, I could see it in the listing photos, their blue front door visible in the background, was a 3-bedroom bungalow. Gray with white trim. A covered porch. A big maple in the front yard. Listed at $687,000. Available immediately, vacant. The seller motivated. I looked at that listing for a long time. Then I picked up the phone and called my financial advisor. "Barbara," I said, "I need to talk about a real estate purchase." "Of course," she said. "Investment property?" "Personal residence," I said, and I gave her the address on Sycamore Lane. Barbara Nguyen had been my financial advisor for 11 years, and she had learned in that time not to ask me why I wanted something, only whether the numbers worked. "Give me 24 hours, she said. "I'll pull the comps and look at your liquidity position." "I already know my liquidity position," I said. "I need you to confirm the purchase won't create any tax complications if I use the investment account." She paused. "Margaret, that's a significant withdrawal." "I know what it is, Barbara." Another pause. Then, "I'll have everything ready by tomorrow morning." I thanked her and hung up. Then I called a real estate attorney named Patricia Howe, whom I'd found through the Oregon State Bar's referral directory. I had met Patricia once, briefly, at a Chamber of Commerce event 3 years earlier when I was scouting Portland as a possible base for my business. She was precise and unhurried, which are the two qualities I require most in a lawyer. I explained the situation in broad strokes. I wished to purchase a specific property, I intended to pay cash, and I needed the transaction handled with complete confidentiality regarding the buyer's identity until closing. "That's not unusual for cash purchases," Patricia said. "We can use a trust or LLC as the purchasing entity." "A trust," I said. "The Harold Ellis Family Trust." I had established that trust 8 years ago for estate planning purposes. Harold's name on it still gave me a particular kind of comfort, as though he were still co-signing my decisions from wherever he had gone. Patricia said she would begin the paperwork. I asked how quickly we could move to closing if the seller was motivated. Cash, no contingencies, motivated seller? 3 weeks, possibly 2. Make it 2, I said. Over the following days, I moved quietly. I drove past Sycamore Lane twice, not in front of the gray bungalow, but through the parallel alley, to look at the property from different angles. The bones were excellent. The roof looked newer. The backyard was overgrown, but had potential. There was a detached garage that, I noted, could serve as a workspace. The listing agent was a young man named Tyler, who seemed genuinely baffled that a cash buyer had materialized within 48 hours of the listing going live. I let him be baffled. I asked practical questions. Age of the HVAC system, any history of foundation issues, HOA status, no HOA. Good. I did not drive past Daniel and Brittany's blue front door. I did not need to. I had the listing photos, and in one of them, the wide shot of the bungalow's exterior, taken from the street. I could see their porch clearly, the 2 rocking chairs they kept there, the hanging fern Brittany was so proud of. The fern looked healthy. It wouldn't for much longer, I suspected. But that wasn't something I spent much time thinking about. It was during the second week of this process, while Patricia was finalizing the purchase agreement and Barbara had confirmed the capital transfer, that I received the information that changed everything from a matter of dignity into a matter of record. I had a friend, Carol Simmons, 71, a retired school teacher who had lived 3 doors down from Daniel and Brittany for 6 years. Carol and I had met at Daniel's housewarming party before Brittany had fully consolidated her position, and we had stayed in touch. Monthly coffee when I visited Portland, occasional texts. Carol called me on a Thursday evening. "Margaret," she said without preamble, "I don't know if I should be telling you this." "Tell me," I said. Carol had been at a neighborhood book club 2 nights earlier. Brittany had not attended. Brittany never attended, but a woman named Sandra, who lived next door to Daniel and Brittany, had. And Sandra, apparently loosened by 2 glasses of Chardonnay, had mentioned something that she thought was common knowledge. Brittany had been planning Margaret's removal since October. Not since the boundaries conversation in the hallway. Since October. 4 months before it happened. 4 months before I arrived with my plants and my laptop and Harold's boxes. Sandra had heard it directly from Brittany herself during a backyard conversation over the fence in November. Brittany had told Sandra that Daniel's mother situation would be resolved by spring. She had described the guest room as already spoken for. Her candle business, the home office, the plan she had outlined to Daniel. She said, and Sandra quoted this carefully because she had found it striking at the time, "She'll have no choice. She sold her house. Where is she going to go?" I sat very still on my rented couch. I had sold my Boise house in December, 3 months after Brittany had made that calculation. I had sold it because Daniel had convinced me, gradually, over several conversations, that I wouldn't need it anymore, that Portland was home now, that they wanted me there. Those conversations had begun in September, 1 month before Brittany told Sandra the situation would be resolved by spring. I understood now. The invitation hadn't been an invitation. It had been a procurement. Get the old woman to sell her house, eliminate her exit, then remove her on a timeline of our choosing. I asked Carol if Sandra would be willing to write down what she'd heard and sign it. "I think she would," Carol said quietly. "She felt terrible when she found out what happened to you. She didn't know it had already been carried out. Can you ask her for me?" "Yes," Carol said. "Margaret, are you all right?" I looked at the pothos in my kitchen window. It had put out 2 new leaves since I'd brought it home. "I am better than all right," I said. "I am informed." 2 days later, I had a signed, dated, notarized statement from Sandra Paulson, 47, of Sycamore Lane, Portland, Oregon, attesting to the conversation she had witnessed between Brittany Ellis and herself in November on the subject of Margaret Ellis's planned removal from the family home. Patricia added it to the file she was building, and on a gray Tuesday morning in early April, I signed the closing documents for the Harold Ellis Family Trust's acquisition of 14 Sycamore Lane, Portland, Oregon, the property directly across the street from my son's blue front door. I drove to the closing. I signed everything. I accepted the keys from Tyler, who still looked mildly bewildered. I drove to the property, unlocked the front door, walked through the empty rooms that smelled of old wood and possibility. I stood at the living room window and looked across the street. I could see their porch, the rocking chairs, the hanging fern. I thought, Daniel, when you see my name on that mailbox, I want you to understand something. This isn't revenge. This is a woman who you underestimated, showing you the cost of that error. Then I went to measure the windows for curtains. I didn't rush the move. I had learned in 68 years that the best actions are the ones executed without urgency, because urgency makes you sloppy, and sloppiness gives other people leverage. I hired a small moving company, 2 young men named Josh and Marcus, who worked efficiently and didn't ask personal questions. And over the course of a single Saturday, my life migrated from the Irvington apartment to 14 Sycamore Lane. I had bought several pieces of furniture in the interim weeks: a proper bed, a reading chair, a desk for my work setup, a kitchen table with 4 chairs I would likely only ever use for myself, but wanted anyway, because a table with 4 chairs says something different about a life than a table with one. I had also bought new curtains, linen, cream-colored, for the living room windows that faced the street. I did not open those curtains on moving day. I wasn't ready for that yet. The discovery happened on Sunday morning, 31 hours after the moving truck left. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard a car door close in a way that carried significance. Not the casual thump of a neighbor leaving for church, but the sharp, declarative slam of someone who has just seen something that made them forget to be careful. I looked through the kitchen window, which faced the side yard, and saw nothing. Then I heard footsteps on my porch. The knock was loud, the kind that is just barely, not a bang. I took my coffee with me to the door. I was wearing my good navy cardigan, the one with the brass buttons, because I had dressed properly that morning, as I always do. Another of Harold's lessons. How you dress tells you what kind of day you're going to have. I opened the door. Daniel and Brittany stood on my porch. Daniel looked like a man who had just discovered the ground was not where he thought it was. His face was doing 3 things at once: confusion, something almost like fear, and beneath it, working its way up, anger. Brittany's face was doing only one thing. Brittany's face was doing what it always did: calculating. "Mom," Daniel said. It was the first time I had heard his voice since he carried my boxes to a 41-degree porch. "Daniel," I said. "Brittany." I didn't offer them a smile. I didn't offer them anything. I held my coffee with both hands and waited. "What is this?" Brittany said. Her voice was controlled, but only just. "What are you doing?" "I live here," I said. "You bought this house?" Daniel said. "The Harold Ellis Family Trust did, yes?" A pause. Brittany's eyes moved from my face to the interior of the house behind me, cataloging, assessing, adding up what she saw and what it meant. I watched her do it. "This is..." "This is insane," she said. Then the control slipped, just slightly, and what came through was not anger, but something closer to panic dressed as anger. "You can't do this. You can't just move across the street from us." "I'm not aware of any ordinance that prevents it," I said. "Are you?" Daniel stepped forward. "Mom, this isn't... You're trying to make a point. I understand. But this is too far. You need to think about what you're doing." "I thought about it quite carefully," I said. "Over several weeks." "We want you to sell it," Brittany said. "We'll help you find something. Somewhere in Portland. Somewhere comfortable, but not..." She gestured at the street, at the 12 yards between my porch and her blue front door. "Not here." "No, thank you," I said. Brittany's composure finally left her. It didn't leave gradually. It left all at once, the way a weather system breaks. "You're doing this to punish us," she said, her voice rising. "You're a vindictive old woman, and you're doing this to make our lives miserable, and I will not allow it. Do you hear me? I will not allow it." "Brittany," Daniel said quietly, but not to stop her, to warn her, which told me he could see what I could see, that she had lost the room. "You have no friends here," Brittany continued. "You have no community here. Nobody on this street wants a bitter old woman sitting in her window watching their house. You'll be miserable and alone, and when you finally come to your senses..." "Brittany." This time Daniel's voice had more edge to it. She stopped. She was breathing hard. I looked at my son. I said, "I have a document, signed and notarized, from a neighbor on this street, attesting to a conversation in which your wife stated that my removal from your home was planned 4 months before it occurred. During the same period you were encouraging me to sell my house in Boise. I shared that document with my attorney. It is in a file. I want you to know that it exists." The porch went very quiet. Daniel's face did something then that I hadn't expected. It cracked. Not in rage, in something that looked, briefly, like shame. Brittany was staring at me. The calculation was back in her eyes, but it was running slower now. Something had jammed the mechanism. "You have 2 choices," I said. "You can leave my porch and we can be neighbors, which will require nothing from you except basic civil behavior. Or you can continue this conversation in a direction that I promise you will find much more uncomfortable. What would you like to do?" They left. I closed my door. I went back to the kitchen, poured out the coffee that had gone cold, and stood at the sink for a long moment, with both hands gripping the edge of the counter. My heart was going faster than I would have liked. I was 68 years old, and I had just faced down my son and the woman who had engineered my homelessness, and I had done it cleanly. But the body doesn't always know the difference between winning and being in danger. My hands were trembling slightly. I allowed that. I spent the next 4 days doing almost nothing. I planted the backyard, bulbs, early perennials, some herbs along the fence. I read 3 novels. I watched the maple in my front yard change its light through the day. I did the minimum necessary for my business, and I let my clients' auto-responses handle the rest. I wasn't hiding, I was recharging. There is a crucial difference. On the 5th day after the porch confrontation, a basket appeared on my doorstep. It was a handsome basket. Wicker, lined with gingham, filled with artisanal items, a jar of local honey, 2 candles in amber glass, a packet of specialty tea, a small card in Brittany's handwriting that said, "Neighbors can have a fresh start, too." B. I looked at the basket for a long time. Then I photographed it, card and all, and sent the image to Patricia Howe with a note. For the file. I brought the basket inside because the honey was good quality, and I saw no reason to waste it. But I did not respond to the card. 2 days after the basket, Daniel called. I let it ring. Then I listened to the voicemail because I needed to know what register he was operating in. His voice was careful, apologetic in texture, but not quite apologetic in content. The difference between a person who is sorry and a person who is performing sorrow in hopes of a specific outcome. Mom, he said, I've been thinking a lot. I want you to know that I hear you. I know things got out of hand. Brittany and I have talked, and we think maybe we all started off on the wrong foot. Can we try to move forward? I love you. Call me back. Started off on the wrong foot, as though he had stepped on my shoe at a party, as though I had not been maneuvered out of my home and my stability with months of deliberate planning, as though the notarized document didn't exist. I did not call back, not that day and not the next. What I did instead was knock on Carol Simmons's door. Carol lived at number 8 Sycamore Lane, 3 houses down from Daniel and 2 houses down from me. She opened the door in a flour-dusted apron and immediately stepped aside to let me in, which is the kind of person Carol is. She doesn't wait to decide if she's glad to see you. She's already glad before you finish knocking. We sat in her kitchen, which smelled of baking and old wood and the particular warmth of a house that has been genuinely lived in. She made tea without asking if I wanted any. She put out a plate of shortbread. I told her everything. Not the financial details. I am still a private woman. But everything about the basket and the voicemail and the signed statement and the house. Carol listened without interrupting, which is also rare and worth noting. When I finished, she set down her teacup and said, "You know what you did? You named yourself on that street. And names matter." "What do you mean?" "I mean Brittany has been the one who defined you on this block, since before you even moved in with them. She told people you were Daniel's elderly mother who needed looking after. She did it kindly, Margaret. She's good at kindness as a tool. But she defined you. And now you've shown up across the street in your own house with brass buttons on your cardigan, and you're defining yourself. And that frightens her." I thought about that. Carol introduced me to 3 other neighbors over the following week. Organically, through walks and front yard conversations, and one spontaneous invitation to a Sunday potluck that 6 households on the block attended. There was Sandra, of course, who greeted me with the particular warmth of someone who is relieved to see you looking well. There was Jim, 64, a retired engineer who lived at the corner and seemed quietly delighted by anyone with strong opinions and a good handshake. There was Maria, 48, who ran a daycare from her home and observed everything on the street with a calm, comprehensive attention that I immediately respected. I did not speak about Daniel and Brittany directly. I didn't need to. I was simply present. I was a neighbor. I went to the potluck. I brought a lemon cake. I listened more than I spoke. And I let the street form its own opinion of me independently of the one Brittany had been preloading. It was at that potluck that Jim said, in the way that people say things that are both casual and deliberate, "Nice to finally meet you properly, Margaret. Daniel's been saying you were, well, you seem like you're doing just fine." "What did Daniel say I was?" I asked pleasantly. Jim glanced toward number 11, Daniel's house, and then back at me. "Struggling," he said. "He mentioned you'd had some financial difficulties." I smiled. I took a small sip of my lemonade. "How interesting," I said. And I said nothing else on the subject because I didn't need to. The house across the street said everything. I could see, from Jim's expression, that he was already revising his received information. Later that evening, I sat on my covered porch as the street quieted down for the night. The maple was doing something beautiful with the last of the light. I could see Daniel and Brittany's living room window, lit from inside, the shapes of them moving occasionally behind frosted glass. I was not watching them with malice. I want that to be clear. I was watching the way you watch weather. Not to control it, but to understand it. The basket had been Brittany's first probe, the voicemail Daniel's. Neither had landed. They would try again. People who have operated through control rarely stop cleanly when the first effort fails. They recalibrate. I was ready to be recalibrated against. In fact, I was counting on it. They came on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the basket. I had been expecting them, not on that particular Saturday, but in that general window. Brittany had a rhythm to her strategies. Probe, withdraw, recalibrate, advance. It was the rhythm of someone who was accustomed to winning through attrition. I had mapped it across the months I'd spent in their house, the small escalations and retreats, the way she would push until you softened, and then push again into the newly softened space. I saw them cross the street from my kitchen window. I had time to set down my coffee, smooth my cardigan, the same navy one, deliberately, and reach the door before they knocked. Daniel was carrying flowers, pale pink dahlias from what I could tell, wrapped in brown paper. Brittany was carrying a paper bag from the French bakery on Morrison Street, the expensive one. They had prepared. "Mom," Daniel said when I opened the door. His smile was the one I recognized from his childhood, the one he deployed when he'd broken something and was hoping hope would do the work of accountability. "Can we come in?" I considered it. I could have said no. Patricia would likely have preferred I said no. But I had learned something important over 68 years of managing people. The most revealing thing a person does is what they do when you give them an opening. So I said yes, and I stepped back from the door. We sat in my living room, which by then had taken on its proper character. The reading chair, the framed photograph of Harold and me from our trip to Oregon coast in 2003, the 2 good lamps that cast the room in warm light. I saw Brittany take in the room as she sat down. I saw the micro-adjustment in her face, the recalibration, as she processed that it was not what she'd expected. It was not the room of a woman who was struggling. "We've been thinking a lot," Daniel began. He was sitting forward on the sofa, flowers in his lap. Brittany was beside him, the bakery bag on her knees, her posture open and soft. She had practiced this posture. I could see its practice in it. About everything. About how things went. "And?" I said. "And we want to start over," Daniel said. We want things to be good between us. We're family." He held out the dahlias. I looked at them. I did not reach for them. "Daniel," I said, "I'd like to believe that. What does starting over look like specifically in your mind?" He glanced at Brittany. The glance was small and quick, but I had 40 years of reading my son's face, and it told me clearly. She wrote the answer. "It looks like everyone moving forward," Brittany said. Her voice was warm. It was remarkable, the warmth. Not manufactured, exactly, but applied, the way you apply a coat of paint to a surface. Not holding on to the past. Not. Her eyes moved briefly around the room, settling on the window that faced their house. Not making choices designed to create discomfort for other people. "I chose a home I loved," I said. "In a neighborhood I had already come to know. What's discomforting about that?" Brittany's warmth adjusted slightly. "Margaret, I think we both know that living directly across the street from your estranged son and his wife is not a neutral choice." "I'm not estranged from my son," I said. "He's welcome to call me. He left a voicemail 3 weeks ago. I heard it." "You didn't call back," Daniel said. "No," I agreed. "I didn't." A pause. Daniel set the dahlias on the coffee table, gently, in what I recognized as a small act of grief. Brittany pressed forward. "What would it take," she said, "for you to consider a different arrangement? Something more, comfortable, for everyone?" "What you're asking me," I said, "is to leave. We're asking you to think about what's best long term," she said. "At your age, being isolated from your family in a house that's more than you need. At your age, there it was, the velvet scalpel. I'm not isolated, I said. I had dinner with Carol Simmons on Thursday. Jim from the corner helped me identify my maple last weekend. Maria's children wave at me every morning when she drops them at the bus stop. I'm less isolated here than I was in your guest room. Brittany's warmth cooled by several degrees. Margaret. She leaned forward very slightly. This situation isn't good for Daniel. For his stress, for his work, for... There are health implications to sustained family conflict. For everyone, including you. I looked at her. I let the silence hold for a full 5 seconds, which is a long time when you're sitting in someone's living room. Are you suggesting that my choice of residence is a health risk? I said. To whom? I'm suggesting, Brittany said, each word careful now, that living this way, watching each other across a street, it's not sustainable. And when things aren't sustainable, eventually, they collapse in ways that aren't good for anyone. Daniel had stopped speaking. He was looking at his hands. I have a different perspective, I said. I think things are quite sustainable. I have a home I own, a business that runs well, neighbors I've grown fond of, and a perfectly clear view of the street, which I find I enjoy. Brittany stood up. The warmth was entirely gone now. You're being willfully obstructive, she said, and childish. I'm being a homeowner, I said, which I have been for 37 years. We'll figure something out, she said. It was a threat in the structure of a sentence. Daniel stood, retrieved the dahlias. It was an automatic gesture, habitual, and it told me more than anything else that morning had told me. He had not expected to leave them here. He had expected a different outcome. At the door he turned. Mom, he said, please. I looked at my son, my boy, who I loved in the way you love something that has caused you your deepest pain and your deepest joy in equal proportion, inseparably. And I said, I'll be here, Daniel. I'm not going anywhere. They walked back across the street. I closed my door and stood in my hallway and acknowledged the fear. It was real. Brittany's last sentence had been designed to generate it, and it had worked in the way that a key works in a lock. It found the right mechanism and turned it. But here is what I also knew, standing in my hallway. Fear, when you don't run from it, doesn't empty you. It fills you. It fills you with the particular clarity of someone who understands exactly what is at stake. I went to my desk. I opened my laptop. I wrote a detailed account of the morning's conversation, time, duration, specific statements, and emailed it to Patricia. Then I worked for 4 hours straight, and I was very sharp that afternoon. The Block Association meeting had been on the calendar for 6 weeks. Jim organized them quarterly, rotating through neighbors' houses. This one was scheduled for the last Saturday of May at Maria's, which could accommodate 12 people comfortably in her large kitchen dining room. 7 households were attending. I had marked the date in my calendar the day Carol told me about it. I had not planned a scene. I want to be clear about that. What I had planned was to be present, to be myself, and to be prepared if a scene arrived on its own, which I had reason to believe it might. Daniel and Brittany attended. They arrived slightly early, which told me they wanted to establish themselves in the room before I got there. I arrived at the stated time with a lemon pound cake on a plate with a card that said, Margaret, number 14, which several people remarked was a lovely touch. I took a chair at the end of the table near Jim and Sandra. For the first 40 minutes, the meeting was about ordinary things. The pothole on the north end, the question of whether the old Henderson's oak needed a city permit before trimming, a proposal to organize a summer block party. I listened, contributed once on the question of the oak tree, and watched the room. Brittany was performing well. She was engaged, She laughed at the right moments. She touched Daniel's arm in ways that communicated partnership. She was, as Carol had said, good with the tools. But she had not accounted for Sandra. Sandra had not intended to say anything. She told me this afterward, carefully, over coffee. She had truly not intended to. But the combination of 2 glasses of the white wine Maria had put out, and the particular moment that arrived, the moment when Brittany said, in response to a question about the summer block party, it would be so nice for the whole neighborhood to feel like a real community, not just strangers living near each other, was more than Sandra could comfortably hold inside. I think community starts with honesty, Sandra said. Her voice was conversational, not pointed. She was looking at her wine glass, about who people are and what they've actually done. The table shifted slightly. These things happen in rooms, small atmospheric changes like a barometric drop. Brittany looked at Sandra. Absolutely, she said smoothly. I've been thinking about that, Sandra continued, since Margaret moved in across the street. It's an interesting thing. Someone told me Margaret was a woman in financial difficulty who needed looking after. And then she bought a house on our street for cash. A quiet moment. Jim said, "Cash purchase?" I said, pleasantly. "The Harold Ellis Family Trust, yes." That's significant," Jim said, looking at me with the expression of a man thoroughly revising a database entry. "Someone told you Margaret was struggling financially?" Maria asked Sandra, not with aggression, with the particular directness of a woman who runs a daycare and has zero patience for indirection. Sandra glanced toward Daniel, not toward Brittany. Toward Daniel. It was a small thing, but rooms notice small things. Daniel was looking at the table. "I may have repeated something I shouldn't have," he said quietly. "Daniel," Brittany said. Her voice was controlled, just barely. "It wasn't accurate," he said. He said it to the table, not to me. The table was quiet in the way tables go quiet, when everyone present has understood something and is waiting to see if anyone will say it. I said it. "I built a business after my husband died," I said. "I have been supporting myself entirely for 17 years. I mention this not for any point of pride, but because I think it's important for the people on this street to know who their neighbor actually is." I paused. There was a period when I was staying with Daniel and Brittany. It ended abruptly, in March, when I was told to leave. I found a place to stay. I took some time, and I bought this house. That's the whole story. A pause. Maria was looking at Daniel. Jim was looking at his wine glass, diplomatically. Brittany said, "That is a very selective version of events." "Then tell the less selective version," I said. Not with heat, with perfect evenness. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She opened it again. What came out was, "You have no right to discuss our family's private—" "You discussed my finances on this street," I said. "You described me as a woman in difficulty, which influenced how my neighbors saw me before I had the chance to introduce myself. I'm simply introducing myself now." "You planned this," Brittany said. Her voice rose. "You came here tonight to humiliate us." "I came here tonight because Jim organized a neighborhood meeting, and I live on this street," I said. "Brittany," Daniel said, low. "She's doing this on purpose, Daniel. She has been doing this on purpose since she moved in here. This is exactly what—" Her voice was climbing, and I watched the room watching her climb. And I watched the moment when Brittany understood. I could see it arrive behind her eyes. That she had lost the room. Not to me. To herself. She stopped. The room was very quiet. Jim said gently, "Maybe we should take a short break." Brittany stood up. She walked out of Maria's house without looking at anyone. Daniel followed her, and at the door he paused and looked back at me. A long, complicated look that I will spend more time understanding in the years ahead than I will spend on almost anything else." Then he went after her. The table sat in silence for a moment. Then Sandra topped up my wine glass. Maria put the plate of cookies in front of me. Jim said, "So, the pothole." And the meeting continued. The Block Association meeting had occurred on a Saturday. By Tuesday, it had become, in the quiet way of neighborhoods, a piece of shared knowledge, discussed over back fences and in parked cars and during long front porch conversations. Patricia called on Wednesday. "I want to prepare you for something," she said. "If Daniel and Brittany decide the notarized statement represents a legal threat, they may try to file something. Harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress. A weak case, but weak cases still take time." "Let them," I said. "You're sure?" "Patricia, I have documentation of a deliberate scheme to eliminate my housing security. I have a notarized witness statement. I have the timeline of my selling my Boise house running parallel to the timeline of their plan. If they want to put any of this in front of a judge, they're welcome to." They did not file anything. A courthouse is a room where documents become evidence, and Brittany understood that better than Daniel did. Daniel came to my door on Friday evening, alone. He looked tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. He was not carrying flowers. I made 2 cups of tea. I put one in front of him. I sat across from him. "She didn't know you'd bought the house," he said finally. "She told me it wasn't possible. She said you didn't have that kind of money." "I know she thought that," I said. "She told me you were struggling, that the Boise house sale was, that you were in debt." He stopped. I believed her. "How long did you know about the plan?" I asked. "The October timeline." He looked at the table. "I knew she wanted the room back. I knew it was coming. I didn't know about October." "But you knew it was coming," I said. "Yes." "And you let it come." "Yes." That was the word I had needed, not an excuse, not a context, just yes. "Daniel," I said, "I love you in a way that isn't negotiable. You are my son, and that is permanent. But I will not pretend that what was done to me was an accident. It was a plan. Brittany built it, and you consented to it." "I know," he said. "What happens next between us depends entirely on whether you can be honest about that, with me and with yourself. Not on Brittany's timeline, honestly." He was quiet a long time. Then, "She's been different lately, since the meeting." "That's between you and her," I said. "That's not my chapter." He nodded, thanked me for the tea with the specific politeness of someone reaching for a behavior long out of reach, and walked back across the street. What followed arrived in pieces through Carol and Sandra. Brittany began separating their finances in June. A family attorney in the Pearl District, not a couples counselor. The candle business she had cited as the reason my room was needed had generated approximately $1,200 in the prior year. Daniel called me in August and asked if we could have dinner. We went to a small Italian place on Alberta Street and talked for 3 hours. It was not comfortable. It was honest, which is a different and more durable thing. He paid the check. I let him. I did not consider it a victory in the way that word is usually meant. Winning against your own son is not something a mother celebrates, but there is another kind of winning, where you refuse to be made small, where you hold the record of what is true, even when people around you insist on a more convenient version. That kind, I claimed, completely, without apology and without compromise. A year is enough time for a street to know you. By the following May, 14 Sycamore Lane had become a house. People noticed. Not grandly, but in the way of a place that is genuinely occupied and tended. The front garden was producing tulips in April, then lavender along the walk, then the climbing rose from Jim's cutting that had taken magnificently to the trellis beside the porch. I had put a bench under the maple, and on good mornings I took my first coffee out there before sitting down to work. My business had grown. The disruption of the previous year had, in some oblique way, sharpened my focus. I expanded into teaching small estate dealers how to build their own online systems, which pushed my monthly income well past its previous ceiling. I hired a part-time assistant named Priya, exceptionally organized, working remotely from Seattle. Carol and I had dinner every Thursday. Sandra had become a genuine friend. Dry humor, excellent sourdough, real patience. Jim coordinated the block's seasonal plantings and pulled me in as his co-conspirator, which suited me deeply. Maria's children still waved at me every morning from the bus stop. These were not small things. The morning coffee, the Thursday dinners, the children at the bus stop. These are the actual texture of a life. I had rebuilt what I'd sold in Boise and built something better. A home that was chosen. A community that knew me as myself. As for the house across the street, Daniel and Brittany separated in August. The hanging fern browned and nobody replaced it. Brittany moved to the Pearl District. The candle business did not follow her. Daniel stayed in the Craftsman house, and he and I had dinner every few weeks through fall and winter. The relationship of two people who had hurt each other and decided honesty was worth more than pretending otherwise. He started seeing a therapist and told me so directly. On his birthday, I made the German chocolate cake Harold had always made. He ate 2 slices and looked, for the first time in a long time, like my boy. There were evenings when I sat under the maple in the last of the light and felt something I can only describe as settled. Not triumphant. Settled. I was 69 years old, a house owned outright, a business running beautifully, a street full of people who knew my name, and a pothos in the kitchen window with 17 new leaves. Harold, I thought sometimes, look at what your careful woman built. What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. Share this story, subscribe, and thank you for listening, dear friends.